This is Macroevolution Part 1, talking about phylogenies, phylogenetic trees, and phylogenetics. So if we want to talk about phylogenetics or the relationship between species, we need to start at the historical beginning. Carolus Linnaeus was a scientist who created the taxonomy classification about the 18th century based on structural similarities, either inward and outward, but we didn't have the capacity to look at DNA yet, so we did not have a way to organize groups of like species based on their DNA. It was just based on gene or phenotype rather than genotype. This scheme, taxonomy, is hierarchical. Basically, the largest, most inclusive groups are the domains. We started out with two, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and then we actually ended up with three. Then we go to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and it is important that you know the order of those. The most specific grouping is going to be your species level, and we can see that the species name is actually the Latin genus and species. So this allows us to not only know that the leopard is pardus as a species, but its genus is Panthera, which is a larger group of cats. And so if I look at any other cat species, wild cat species, I should be able to see Panthera as a genus if it is related. It's basically looking just at shared characteristics. And so we know that now we have the capacity to look much more deeply at how things are related. In sort of recent time, I mean, before both you and I were born, but in recent time, as far as science is concerned, we actually ended up dividing domains, the largest groups, into three groups: eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. Originally, it was eukaryotes and prokaryotes, but the prokaryotic group decided that it needed to be divided into archaea and bacteria. And so these groups form, they are more and more inclusive as we get higher. So domains include all the species. When we get to kingdoms, they are divided a little bit further, and so on. A taxonomic unit at any level is called a taxon. So whether it's a group of species or a group of same class, always going to be a taxon. And as it turns out, when we classified organisms in this way, they actually shared a lot of the same genetics and had a very similar evolutionary history. And so although we were just looking at phenotype at the time, a lot of species were actually very related. And so it just goes to show you that our phenotypes are created by our genotype, which means if I'm similar looking, I probably have a similar genotype to another organism that I share characteristics with. When we talk about phylogenetic trees and phylogeny, it's the study of evolutionary relationships among a group of individuals. This phylogenetic tree is branching similar to our cladogram, but remember cladograms, we see that kind of slanted line, and this gets a little bit more complex. Phylogenies are based on morphology, so physical characteristics, and the fossil record, also based on embryology, which is essentially looking at how similar did we look when we were talking about like development, fetal development, and we're also looking at DNA, RNA, and protein similarities. And so we see that we've got these three big buckets of things that we use to classify different species on a phylogenetic tree. The basics of the phylogenetic tree that we need to know about, because you'll need to be able to read one as well as create one, is we need to understand that phylogenies can be illustrated using the trees or cladograms. And so they're really used interchangeably. It's just good to know that cladograms are going to be that slanted line with a single species coming off the line, whereas a cladogram is going to look linear left to right and branch. This cladogram is used to represent a hypothesis about the evolutionary history of groups. And so what this means is that this is by no means true. It's just trying to hypothesize about when a species deviated from a specific group. The phylogenetic tree represents the true evolutionary history. The length of the lineage and the nodes correspond to the time of a divergent events. So we talked about this in class, the idea, or the question was, does where a branch on the cladogram dictate time? It does not. But on a phylogenetic tree, which is what we're about to look at, it does make a difference. The longer the line before branching, the actual longer the amount of time. And when the node, or where a division is located, that means it occurred at that time. When we look at a phylogenetic tree, we'll see it oriented this way or this way. The phylogenetic tree represents the true evolutionary history. So this is based off of fossil records and DNA, which shows evidence of not only a new species evolving, but also the time. What we can see here is that on the left, we see a scale of time. And so it basically gives us an idea of when the species deviated from whatever group it deviated from, or we call it speciated, this new species. Also, we want to talk about extant versus extinct. Extant are going to be species that are still alive. Any species which line reaches all the way to the top indicates that it's still present today, whereas any species, and we'll see them 1, 2, 3, 4 in from the left, are going to be species that are extinct, species that are no longer around. This is another example of a phylogenetic tree. It's just oriented a little differently. This is actually the more common phylogenetic tree. This phylogenetic tree is a reflection of the Linnaean classifications of carnivores. However, what we know now using DNA and protein analysis is that some of these would not be as related as we originally thought. For example, birds are now classified as true reptiles. So if we look at the phylogenetic tree of birds and reptiles, they're actually going to be very close and branching off from a common ancestor. When we're using scientific terms to refer to things in a phylogenetic tree, we want to talk about it in this way. A taxon is any group of species designated by a name. So taxon A, B, it's usually the end of a line. A node is a point in which two new lineages are deviating. We also call them a branch point. If more than two lineages are shown, it indicates an unresolved pattern of divergence. Essentially, what that means is we see for taxon D, E, and F, that's going to be essentially two species deviated from the ancestor, and then the ancestor also proceeded onward, which is sort of rare, and so we would want to look at like what does that mean. Anything that is related are on the same branch we call sister taxa. They are immediately related by an ancestor. They are groups or organisms that share an immediate common ancestor. But yeah, that's that. When we talk about the idea of rotating branches, the two phylogenetic trees illustrate the same relationship. The vertical branches have been rotated, and that's it. And so there's a lot of ways that we can visually represent the same relationships. When we talk about the definition of a clade, so a taxa is the very end of each of these lines. A clade is any taxon that consists of all of the evolutionary descendants of a common ancestor. So there's some overlap here. We see that each colored rectangle is a true clade. And so I could be very specific about the two clades that are the two taxa that are identified in the yellow block, but they are also part of the green larger clade. These all just show past a certain node point, all of the species that are related. We also have 3 different types of clades. A true clade is a monophyletic group that contains a common ancestor and all of its descendants. That is, literally we pick out a node and anything onward from that point is related. A paraphyletic is one that has all of the common ancestors, but it does not include all the descendants. So if we look at the second group, we see G, which is a descendant of all the common ancestors, is not included. And then a polyphyletic group does not have a unique common ancestor. We see that C on the far right does not have a common ancestor with D, E, F, or G, but is included for some reason. Usually we talk about like that we see other relationships for some reason, either via DNA or things like that, that are not shown in the phyletic tree. This is confusing because when we talk about a cladogram, we think that we would have clades or clades in a cladogram. It's not true. On our phylogenetic tree, we have our clades. When we talk about these changes, how do we get a new species forming? We want to talk about anagenesis and cladogenesis. Anagenesis, or a phyletic change, is the accumulation of changes in one species that lead to speciation over time. So eventually we see, over many, many years, changes accumulate and we end up with a new species. It's the evolution of a full population away from the original ancestor. When those changes have accumulated, the ancestral population is considered extinct. It did not necessarily die off, but all of the species in that population have now become a different population. That's anagenesis. Cladogenesis is the budding of one or more species from a species that already exists. And this is more common. We see it as the result in biological diversity. Usually, cladogenesis involves the physical separation, and so we see that something prevents two groups from mating. Both of them continue to survive, but they start to speciate, which means that we see two new species forming. When we talk about recreating phylogenies or getting the information we need for a phylogenetic tree, the formation of the fossil record is one of the key components to allowing us to determine the time length as well as the common ancestors. Basically, what we do is we look at the layer in which a fossil is found in relation to the other fossils around it. The way that these fossils are formed is rivers bring sedimentary rock over fossils that are located anywhere, can be in the ocean floor. Over time, they start to solidify into sedimentary rock. We have things fossilizing. Eventually, water goes away, and then we have our sedimentary rock exposed, and we can kind of dig down and take a look at all the different strata, the layers of soil.